This is the Visions and Tones podcast with Dr. T.
Welcome to the new entry of the Visions and Tones podcast. Today I've got two great powerhouses. I'll do a little bit of a bio, but they'll correct me and chip in a few more information about themselves. I've got Dr. Edith Botchway-Commey, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne. She is a passionate neuropsychology researcher with interest in improving sleep, mental health, and the quality of life outcomes in children with neurological conditions and in the general population. So Dr. Edith is originally from Ghana, but she obtained her master's degree in cognitive neuropsychology from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in 2015, and also completed her PhD in 2019, which was on neuropsychology, touching aspects of traumatic brain injury, sleep, and mental health in the University of Melbourne in Australia. And the second guest that I have is Dr. Uchechukwu Levi Osuagwu, who is a senior lecturer and an academic lead in rural health from the School of Medicine in Western Sydney University. And he attained a Doctor of Optometry in the year 2000 from Abia State University in Nigeria, and a Master's of Science degree in Optometry and Vision Sciences with a focus on ocular health in 2014 from Aston University, Birmingham in the UK, where he actually completed his Master's in Distinction. Dr. Levi completed a PhD from the Institute of Health and Biomedical Innovation from the Faculty of Health from Queensland University of Technology in 2017. Doctors, it's good to go through your bios. I mean, you can see that you've been all around, you've been working. I mean, today we'll be talking about a paper that you published that basically position aspects of African migrants in different contexts in the world. But what I like is the fact that you've been in different places. I mean, Dr. Levi, you've been in the UK, you worked in Saudi Arabia, you're now in Australia. Dr. Edith, you've been in Amsterdam, you're now in Australia, probably have been also in different places. You've engaged a lot of different African people. They shared with you probably their experiences in different places. How has that experience been for you as a migrant crossing over different, contexts while you do your professional work, but encountering people? How are the talks from people in general?
Well, I can start on that. Thanks for the question. I would say the talks have been insightful because their destinations are often different. So you talk about me being in the Netherlands, coming from Ghana, going to the Netherlands. I spent some time in Germany as well, and a couple of other countries traveling in Europe and engaging with African people. So the contexts have been different, but the conversations and the themes are often similar. And some of those similar themes are some of the things that we picked up in the systematic review as well. So things around shared experiences and feeling around belonging, having a sense of belonging and reaching for goals, and the struggles associated with that in the work context and social context are very similar.
And for you, Dr. Levi?
Yeah, look, in addition to what Edith said, I guess the tours are just life lessons for me, and that makes me, when you're doing research, you're able to relate to what you're reading. I'll give an instance. If you've worked in Saudi Arabia before, it's a very different lifestyle. But being from there, I do appreciate what freedom is. I appreciate when people feel they are less privileged. They need help, because you've seen that over time with different groups of people, those who are super wealthy, those who are very poor. And to see the way that we approach research from that context of I understand what is happening here, it gives you a very different way of writing papers. It makes you also pick topics very sensitively. When we went into this study, we all felt connected to it.
Yeah.
One way or the other, we have been part of that story. We felt it, we've seen it, we've heard it. So we thought, what a better way to tell the story from an African lens, where we are not diluting what we are finding. We're actually empowering that discussion to find a way to make it more open so people feel free to talk about mental health. So those thoughts were very beneficial because I could relate to that myself as well.
Amazing. I mean, thanks. So the paper you've sort of been alluding to both is titled Mental Health and Mental Health Help-Seeking Behaviour Among First-Generation Voluntary African Migrants. And this was a systemic review. So before maybe we get on to the second segment, which has more questions, I just want to start from the title in itself. Maybe if Dr. Edith, you can sort of break down for us what do we mean by first-generation voluntary African migrants, and then Dr. Levi, if you can touch for us what exactly is systemic review, so that the people who hear this conversation and those who get access to the paper, they can have a better understanding of what we're talking about.
Thank you. So what is first-generation voluntary African migrants? Great question. There are different classes of migrants, right? And like Levi said, we have been part of this story and we understand the plights of first-generation African migrants, but also other generation African migrants. So what are first-generation African migrants? These are migrants who have left their country of origin, often voluntarily, to study, work, or join maybe a partner, their partner, their love partner, or ND. And the reason why we have added the word voluntary is that was by choice. Now, we would compare that to people who termed as non-voluntary migrants, who often migrate for reasons of maybe war or asylum or seeking refuge. Yeah. And in terms of the generations, the people who come in first are sort of the first generation, and then let's say Levi's children can, if they are born in Australia, can be classified as second generation migrants, or if they are born not in Africa, can be classified as second generation migrants because their context of being born and raised in is a bit different from the country that they find themselves growing in. So that is the main difference there. And the reason why we decided to focus on this class of migrants is because it's not to limit the experiences or untell the experiences of non-voluntary migrants. It's so important. But we also think that it's important to tell a holistic story, because a lot of the literature, and which we will delve into in a bit, shows a lot of outcomes across refugees and asylum seekers. There's a lot of that, often because there's a lot of funding for that work. And a lot of those papers often talk about migrants in general without teasing out these differences. And again, it's not to limit or to underscore the experience of any subgroup, but there are significant and important issues with these two groups that should and can be talked about. And the reason why this is important, because we know that ethnic identity of migrants is a very pertinent issue when it comes to migration. And some studies have found that ethnic identities tend to be quite stronger in first generation migrants. So like myself and Levi, the identity of where we come from, I come from Ghana, it's quite strong. So that tends to influence how I see the world and do things and my experiences and my mental health. Whereas in second generation migrants, that experience can be a little different. So it's quite important because of that ethnic identity and its impact on migration and mental health and health outcomes. It's important that we understand the unique factors that are affecting each group. Yeah.
Amazing. Dr. Levi.
And so if we look at systematic review as a type of study that we wanted to undertake, we started to look at what we could start with to provide evidence that will lay a foundation for something bigger. So systematic review is in the hierarchy of evidence. There's a pyramid. Systematic review is up there. Is the strongest level of evidence. So it means you can rely on any output from that evidence to tell a story. So why that is because it summarizes evidence that is across the board on a particular topic. And it does that in a structured way. That's why it's called systematic. There's a system. There's a process. I'm going to search 1-2 databases. These are the topics I want to search on. This is the kind of areas I want to broaden my search. So you lay a foundation. And because you're laying a foundation, you've planned that study. So that planning has a process. There's a way you write it. There's a reporting standard. There are things that you need to make sure are included in that particular article for you to stand that level of strong evidence. Yeah. So that's what we are looking for. For the fact that we've provided this evidence now, people can then go into that study and decide, okay, we identified this because so many studies have been looked at and we summarize them in a very simple way that you can pick that study and understand what is happening around that subject of discussion. In this sense, it's mental health seeking for those of African origin who are already living here voluntarily. So we had a structure. And because that structure provides evidence, people can say, look, yeah, this I can rely on this because they've actually done their study rigorously. So it's a robust evidence.
Right.
The reason we wanted to start with that, and from that study, we have built offshoots of research. Because we've done that now, we've applied for a grant, Edith and our group, on looking at women with postnatal depression. Because we found that that's another area that nobody has even talked about among African women. Although we were not successful, but that gave us a background to say, oh, really? This is really something that nobody's talking about. But we're seeing it in this review. We've also looked at the prevalence of mental health within African community. Those who are non-refugees, those who are non-asylum seekers. There's nothing in that space as well. And because we've shown that evidence, people can just jump onto that. And I can tell you for sure that as we speak today, somebody has looked at that paper and has developed a study based on that. Because you don't have to do it again. We've done the summarization.
True.
We've analyzed the study and say, look, there's a gap here that we need to fill. There's a gap here that we need. So that's what systematic review does for you.
And as you're talking about other people may have read your paper to go do other research, I know that you've actually built your own research, which we're going to talk a little bit more about it soon. And again, you started to touch about the rigor of the use of systemic evidence, systemic review, which I'll get back to this just in a little while because I wanted people to understand how exactly did the rigor play itself out in terms of your paper as to how many sources did you have to sort of have on your side, which ones did you sort of designate to be the literature and which ones did you designate to be sort of the data that you focus on so that people can understand that indeed systemic review can understand why systemic review is considered one of the strongest evidence sitting on top of many other methods, so to say. But maybe before we get there, can we sort of go through the motivation of the study? What exactly inspired you to get onto this study? Yes, you've touched a little bit, Dr. Levi, that it's because you saw a little bit of scant literature covering certain aspects, particularly about Africans and their experiences in the diaspora. But what more can we say in terms of the motivation, basically? Because I can see there's also a few other scholars who were involved in this research. So I'm pretty sure maybe even them, they had different kind of motivations to sort of take part in this study. If you can sort of outlay that for us.
I think the story of this paper can't be told without the ARNA, which Levi has mentioned earlier before. And the ARNA is the African Research Network, Australian Research Network for African Academics, led by Dr. Obed Adonting Kisi. And the aim of the network, I could summarize it in 3 points. And one is to bring African researchers in Australia together. The other is to foster collaborations across various fields. So we've got engineers and optometrists and psychologists. There's a whole range of professionals in there. And the final one is to conduct systematic and constructive research projects that provide insights into the experiences of Africans and African migrants. So that last one is sort of where this review sits. So we are sort of we have those shared values and those shared passion through the ARNA, and that's where this review came from. In terms of the topic itself, we know that we are all migrants. So it's sort of the thing on our mind when we wake up. We're like, what challenges do I have to solve today? It's all problem solving day and night. So a lot of our discussions sort of resonate around that. And we know that migration trends have surged a lot in recent years. The World Health Organization is talking about it. Countries are putting in place policies to manage the situation and everything, right? So along with that surge and along with COVID and all the things happening around the world is a surge in mental health problems as well. Not just in migrants, mental health problems are across the populations. But we are seeing from the literature that, and from conversations, especially anecdotally, that mental health problems are especially quite high in migrant populations. Now, we started a conversation around, okay, migrant populations are affected. But when you go into the literature, like I said before, you see a lot of work around refugees and asylum seekers. So that sort of probed us to go, okay, we do know that you could say Dr. Levi is a professor and we can all relate to the mental health challenges. I would say, okay, I haven't had a mental health breakdown, but there are times when you have a low mood, right? Who is telling the stories of us non-voluntary African migrants, African migrants who are also experiencing some of these challenges. And then there's a next question of whether the factors that impact our mental health is the same as the ones that impact non-voluntary African migrants. So, for example, if someone has a refugee background or an asylum-seeking background versus, let's say, Levi, who has been to, is it Kuwait, Levi? Yeah, to work, and then Australia to work, and he migrated voluntarily. Are the factors influencing their mental health the same? As someone with a neuropsychology background, I can say yes and no. There may be some common factors there, mainly because of the fact that we are all from Africa and those cultural factors, right? But there's also trauma, which is a very, very important factor when you're thinking about mental health. And we do know from the literature that the risk of trauma in people who have, let's say, had a war experience or feel threatened and unsafe in the space where they belong and have to flee is a lot higher. So if someone has gone through that trauma experience and the impact of trauma on their mental health is so much higher. And so that one trauma experience or multiple trauma experiences can lead to a lot of other risk factors that can impact their mental health. So if someone have been through severe trauma and, for example, they're struggling to find motivation to move on, we cannot blame them. We cannot say, oh, why don't you move? Why don't you just get working? You're just lazy, because there's all this pile of situations that they're dealing with emotionally, which as a human being, because of how we are wired and how our brain is wired, you cannot go past and start achieving goals in quotes, when you have all of that to deal with. Mm-hmm. You can keep trying to wake up and go, but you keep, it's like a cycle. Mm-hmm. This thing will just keep knocking you down until we deal with the trauma. So there are a lot of issues to unpack there. And so there is that. And then we come to Dr. Levi and we think, okay, what factors, he doesn't have a trauma background. So maybe the factors that are impacting his mental health are different, but we are not asking the question in the literature. So that is sort of what inspired us to do the review. And we are like, we don't know if this has been done. Let's see. Are there any studies at all that have looked into that? And we did struggle to find studies, and I can give you the breakdown of the studies, how many studies we went through later when we get to that. Yeah.
Yes, because I wanted to actually get to that part now where we sort of speak about the rigor of the systemic in terms of your paper. So I think both you and Dr. Edith and Dr. Levi can sort of unpack that for us. It's the right timing to sort of get onto that.
Yeah, I guess just before we head into that, there's a different story to this for me. Mm-hmm. The Australian Research Network of African Academics started as a group. We wanted to have collaborative network. Wanted a platform to bring all Africans who are into academics together for a common goal of what can we do as a group? How can we make an impact? And the easiest way academics work is finding a research purpose. What research can we all buy into? So for us, mental health stood out. It stood out because somebody may have done something close to it, much close to it in children, tried to do something around. So everybody was like, okay, I've had that little experience, I can do this area of study. And that became a focus as a starting point for us. And then when we started looking into the literature, it was very obvious that even in the meetings that we hold, that people do need to start talking about this. You just couldn't help but ask, how are you doing? So with that conversation and the way things were going, there was just no other question to ask. Can we look at what is happening around our community, people like us in the area of mental health? And don't forget, it's not a joke in Australia. 8.5 million Australians today, as we speak, who are adults, suffer from one mental disorder or another. It's not new. So we are not left out. And for migrants as well, our own case is even worse. Evidence has shown that migrant populations suffer more in this aspect of mental health than the local population themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there's already an issue. But because nobody talks about it, we tend to sweep it under the carpet. So what the systematic review did was to bring all of us together with that interest that we have. To say, okay, where can we find something that unites us? Besides our workspace. I'm a lawyer, yes. I work in academia. I teach in the university. People are passing through the same thing, but in different spaces of life. Their work description might be different, but we have a common cause. We all want to stay mentally healthy. And to do that, we need to find what the evidence around that is. Now, the trick to that is when that discussion came up, it felt very personal to me. And the reason when we talk about mental health, I feel like I'm more connected to it now than I was before. Because just within the time this study was about to start, I lost a very close friend out of not seeking proper help. And I did tell that to the group. It's an evidence that people like me do not understand what mental health seeking is. And often delay to seek help or never seek help at all. And I had very close experience to that. I'm losing a very close friend today because there was no opportunity that he thought was appropriate for him to seek help for. And even when he passed away, the community denied him. So that really shook me. I'm like, wow. So we don't understand this at all. So when these issues of research came up, that's why I say we are in that space. So we understand it more, then we can tell the story. And this is where, when this study started, it really opened up, unraveled the discussion in our meetings about mental well-being. That we do that almost every time we meet. How are you going? As part of the agenda.
So sorry to hear there about your friend, Dr. Levi. And I mean, as you're articulating now, I'm trying to basically figure out whether the purpose of the study also did it entail as to this is more advocacy, or it's because we're also trying to propose certain initiatives that Africans can find help or even education. What exactly was sitting there at the center? Because it seems like, Dr. Levi, you hold the topic very dear to heart. Not to say, Dr. Edith, you're not, but obviously the reasons, as to why one ended up coming into the project, there's something special about it. Probably even the other contributors, other researchers in this project, they've got their own stories, But so what final conclusion are you guys making out of this? Is it going to be just an educational paper, or this initiative that we're intending to sort of do out of it?
Yeah, look, I think just because I spoke last, I would change the order of things. Now, the bit that comes here is from this study, we have been able to develop other programs. We've been able to start rolling our studies even in Africa for people to start discussing mental health. We've used this study to obtain small grants from Rural Health Institute to then look in depth into the different communities, those in the rural places. How do they feel about this? How do they connect with people? From this study, we've also started making inputs into community discussions, because when you read this, you're able to say, oh, okay, I can relate to this. Yep. We're able to propose a grant paper because we found evidence that this needs attention. There are other things that we can do in that space, working with other bodies as well, in our group, talking to communities. Podcasts like this is because you've seen that study. If we didn't publish it, you may not have called both of us to be here. So there's a reason why POP has come up this way. That attention is what we need people to start looking into. Can we talk about this more? Because the more we talk about it, the more people open up their hearts to receive the help that is already available to them. The more they understand what mental health is. So I think that's one of the key things that we are driving with this study.
Amazing. Yeah. Can we sort of break down? Sorry, Dr. Edith, I know you want to jump in, but at the same time, I'm trying to chase more of the things we can talk about. The rigor. Let's talk maybe about the rigor. Feel free to chip in whatever you wanted to chip in first, Dr. Edith, and then take us to the rigor.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that within the ARNA, we keep discussing about the potential of starting some initiatives in the community. So whether it is about podcasts like this or going to the community to have active conversations about the findings of the review, but also findings of other studies emerging from the group. And that's one of the active ways that we hope to engage community and make an impact. Yeah. So rigor. This review took a lot of time. And as you would have seen, it took a lot of efforts from massive amounts of people. There are about 9-10 people who are co-authors on the review. So kudos to all of them. We started with generating 9,738 papers, just to give you a scope of how many papers we had to go through to get to the answers or the results that we got to. 9,000 papers. And I just want to give a shout out to Obed again, and Emeka, Merimbe, and David Chisanga, because they were very, very active in the whole review process, and Levi himself included as well, where we had to go through each of these papers, screen them for abstracts and titles, and then get to the next stage, which was reading the full papers. And for that full paper review, we had 45 papers that were reviewed. So with the first stage, you're just looking at abstracts and titles. Then you get to the next stage where you're actually reading all the papers to see if those papers meet the criteria for this review. And there were about 6 criteria that were laid for this review, some of which we have already talked about. The fact that we want studies that are looking at migrants, mental health in African migrants, and specifically first generation voluntary African migrants. And there were some specifications for the type of study as well that we wanted to include. So after reading those 45 papers, we checked out a whole lot and focused on 8, because it was those 8 papers that had the evidence to answer the questions that we were asking in the review. And the questions we had were 3 main questions. So one was around what the prevalence, and one was around the mental health challenges associated with, the first one was around mental health challenges and associated risk and protective factors impacting African migrants. The second one was around the barriers and facilitators of mental health and help-seeking behaviours in migrants. And the last one looked at the relationship between mental health and help-seeking behaviour in African migrants, in first-generation voluntary African migrants. So that was how rigorous the whole process was. And we ended up with these 8 papers published from Canada, from the United Kingdom, from the US, from Spain, China, and Italy. So you can see there was no paper from Australia in the review, which tells us that we actually need to do some work here, specifically on this topic. There are papers on migrants, but not for this. So we came up with a lot of papers, but none of them was providing the distinction that we needed to be able to answer the questions for this specific review. And the studies included migrants from Ghana, from Nigeria, Morocco, Zimbabwe. And there were a couple of studies that didn't specify the countries, but they just said that they had people from sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the scope of the review and how rigorous this was. It took us about a year to go through this whole process and get to the point of even saying, we think we have reasonable data to start writing. So it took a long time.
Because one of the things that I found, it's a very interesting approach that you did. And when I was looking at the methodology section where you sort of describe some of the papers, I see that some were actually more quantitative, qualitative, and cross-sectional. And I tried to think in a systemic review, how do you make sense of that? I'm more coming from a mixed method of qualitative and quantitative, and I've never done a systemic review. For me, I found it very complex. And the fact that I need to spend enough time to really interrogate the paper that I'm reading, because, I mean, let's be honest, there's been a rise of false documentation also in research. And some people, you look, for instance, the grievance hoax study, which came out in the US with, a few scholars trying to sort of tarnish the leftist politics to say there is no intense review. It's just, following keywords. If something has got critical race, then it gets published. If something has got Black Lives Matter, then it gets published. So all those complexities for me are the ones that I felt, my goodness, systemic review, I really applaud you guys. You've really tackled a big giant there. If we can sort of tap into the findings, let's spend time a little bit on the findings, because I think you were interested also in this one, Dr. Edith, when we started. So let's unpack the studies from the first question, because you said you had 3 sets of questions, main questions into the study. If we can maybe go in that particular order, what are we finding in the research?
Findings. Yeah. I was just still thinking about your previous reflections on the process. It was rigorous, and this was the first time for me that I did a mixed method systematic review, because I've done a couple of systematic reviews, but they're often quantitative. And this mixed methods process was a bit different. And the way that we got to do that is because of collaboration. So within the team, we had people who are qualitative researchers. So for example, all the qualitative studies were reviewed by them. So not reviewed in terms of screening, but extraction of data was done by them. They did the risk of bias assessment, which is how you determine the level of quality of evidence within a paper. So they did that because that's their language. I don't speak qualitative, so I'm like, yeah, can't deal with this. And they did that. And then we, the quantitative people, focus on that. So that's one of the demonstrations of the power of collaboration.
Right.
So within the scope of my expertise, I go, I'm not including qualitative papers because it's too complex. But we're able to do that because of collaboration. I think recently as well, there are more processes around how to manage this within qualitative studies. So because other people have built that evidence, we're able to take up from that and go, okay, this is a tool we can use to judge quality because someone did that work. So there's the beauty of research. We build on each other's knowledge and each other's strengths and expertise. Levi, did you want to chip in something?
Yeah. I think that was good. And look, we can't take away Edith played a very strong role here. She was the coordinator of this study. Everything we've done in this study, Edith led it from start to finish. And you can't take away that, because that coordination is a very strong part why we were able to publish. Because when you get people of different status in a group, some are professors, head of departments, and having so many roles, and you're able to manage them through somebody like Edith, who is still climbing the top of the ladder, it's a tough gig. But she did it very, very well. Now, the other bit is, for a study to be a mixed method, Tony, there's a reason for it. We didn't set out to do a mixed method study. When you start a systematic review, you do a preliminary search to understand what is out there. So what we found was there are very little evidence that are quantitative in nature. Very little. And he couldn't have made a study if we had just focused on the quantitative bit. But we saw so many qualitative, because Africans tell stories. So a lot of those were on stories. They were qualitative. So that's how we said, wow. So this also brings with another complexity. You're going to use two different tools. One tool will be used to assess quantitative studies. Another tool will be used to assess qualitative studies. Each step of the way, there are two different tools, because the way you do them are different. So that's why we were blessed by having those other team members who were experts in qualitative. So, that makes life easy. And then it's had an easier role because we had people to focus on different things. So it's not just that you're setting out to do mismatch, it's because there's really no evidence that can justify the use of one method only, neglecting the stories that are very important to Africans as well. So that's really what I wanted to chip in here.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the findings.
100% agree. So the findings of the review, I would start with, the first aim or question was around the risk factors and the protective factors associated with mental health in this group. So I'll start with the risk factors. Now, with regards to the results, as Levi said, there were a couple of studies that were qualitative, and then there were some that were quantitative. And what we found was that all the qualitative studies were done in women with postnatal depression. And so we sort of separated the results for those ones because it's quite a distinct condition from the results for the other migrant groups. So workers and other groups. So I'll start with the results, the risk factors associated with the general group, so not the postnatal depression women. So we had risk factors like lower satisfaction with housing conditions, having a good place to stay. We know that, like Levi is on holiday right now, chilling in a very luxurious pool and apartment with a pool and all of that. So we know the importance of environment for our mental health, and he's on holiday, right? So that tells us we need these good environments to thrive mentally. There was also perceived experience of negative attitudes from local people. which we can't share the story without talking about discrimination and racism. So that was one of the risk factors. Language barriers was one which was reported in a US study. So people who couldn't speak English in that setting had a higher risk of mental health problems because you get isolated. We can relate to that, right? In the women with postnatal depression, some of the risk factors associated with their mental health was neglect from health professionals. And what the women had to say around that was that often after they've had the baby, their attention goes to the baby a lot. But sometimes too, when the health professionals who come home to help these women also just focus on the baby and sometimes hardly even ask the woman, how are you doing? So over time, the woman just goes, well, I guess I don't matter. And they just internalize everything. And some of them are like, oh, I need to be asked this, how am I doing? Right? How am I doing? So that I can talk about how I'm doing. Or even when I try to share how I'm doing, it's sort of pushed aside. And I came here for your baby. And sometimes some women said even GPs do that, not really listening to how the woman is doing. There's also lack of support from spouse. So spousal support for these women was a big one. And I think we hear the stories in our community as well about women who are struggling just because their spouse is not supportive. And I think as a woman, I'll add a voice to this, that when we are out here, it's just so hard. We know it. Men and women alike. We are isolated in a way from our community, which is home. But the person you live with can become like your best friend. And if that support is not supportive, if that's like the one person that can give you meaningful support is not helping, then that could be huge. That can be a huge source of distress. So the woman can still go out and maybe have relationships in church, in community, but it's not as meaningful as the person they are with, feeling supported from that. So that's one thing that we should talk about in our community and encourage. There was also issues around stigma that increase risk in these women. They talked about how that sometimes they are afraid that they'll be stigmatized if they talk about their mental health. And so then they just keep it, even with their own friends within community. And I can attest to this with some friends who can't talk to their own friends within their community because they're afraid that they would say they are sick or they are not feeling, they have this problem. So there's that stigma as well. And sometimes there's also issues around financial status of the family that impacts them. Some women take on so much stress because they feel like, oh, I've had this baby right now. I can't wait to support my husband. And they take on that financial stress. They may not express it, but they feel almost guilty for not being able to help. And I think that comes back to the spousal support. How are we encouraging them? How are we having conversations to let them know that I know you're not working right now, but don't feel you're not, because you're contributing so much more than even maybe I am, because you're spending so much time with this baby right now. Sometimes just verbalizing it can take off that stress, because when they see their partner struggling, they feel like guilt. I should be helping him. But honestly, girl, you can't do much. You've gone through all of this. You need to rest. There's all of that. But women don't get the chance to have conversation about that and be reassured that they are contributing in the most meaningful, in a very meaningful way as God meant it to be. There was also breastfeeding. So a lot of women have pain from that, and that was sort of impacting their mental health. Because they have pain from that, sometimes they are not able to feed their child, and then they feel guilty. So there's like this loop of guilt and pain that can impact their mental health. If the child is not sleeping well and temperamental, then they're like, oh my gosh, they feel bad. Everything happening to the child is their fault. So they're carrying all this guilt and shame. And we need to have these conversations in our community so that women know that, look, it's okay. If you can't breastfeed, you can find other ways to feed the child. It's okay, because it impacts them really a lot. I'll just talk about the protective factors. Or Levi, did you want to chip in something before I continue?
Yeah, I can't wait, but see the passion in how Edith wants to help women. I mean, Tony, if you listen to that, you didn't hear any man talk there. That's the passion. That's what makes the group.
Yeah.
That's everybody brings in this a different passion. And that's what makes this paper stand up for me, is because we all have where we are coming from. And Edith feels that passion to help women, and it shines through in the paper as well. Whereas for me, I'm looking at the African cultural beliefs about our mental health. Do you know we don't have a word for mental health? If I ask you, Tony, in your South African language, what do you call mental health?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard one.
I mean, if you want to speak something, maybe Zulu, to somebody in South Africa, what would you tell them mental health is? What's the word you can use for that?
You wouldn't necessarily find it, because the actual translation of it makes someone, it sounds as if you're saying someone is delusional. If you're
this is exactly what I'm trying to drive.
Yeah.
I was in a meeting, the African Day, and I asked the same question. I said, pop in the chat window what you describe mental health to your old mother at home, somebody who doesn't understand English. And all that came out from different African countries was crazy, insane, delusional, madness.
But it's not the same.
Madness. This is what we Africans identify mental health with. That's where the problem begins. That is why our community segregates among these people. That's why when somebody passes of mental health, we don't even attend the funeral because we think he's a mad person. There's a witchcraft behind it. There's one God that they are worshiping that's driving them crazy. Nobody talks about it as an illness. Nobody talks about it as something that has to do with your health, that even the diet you take can influence your mental well-being. Nobody sees that. So this is where it's a very different dynamic. And that's the message we are driving from this study forward. Because we need to start talking about this and educating people that mental health does not equate madness. It does not equate insanity. It does not mean delusion. It's just a state of health that is not normal. Just like you can have diabetes, you can have hypertension. Nobody calls you crazy. Nobody pushes out in the community. People die of that regularly. So that's where this is where this paper is a very different. We found that again, that's a big issue in our community. And there's also a cultural expectation for a woman, like Edith is saying, to prove that she's a strong person. And for that sake, I can't seek help. I remember what we're talking about is the barriers to mental help seeking. It's not just the mental health, just that, okay, you have a problem, we identify that. Can you seek for help? What's delaying you from doing that? What's preventing you from doing that? There are these resources, Lifeline, all these agencies provide. It's not dependent on race, but yet we don't go there. We don't think it's necessary for us. Because as an African man, I need to overcome that. I'm superhuman.
I'm superhuman. I'm strong.
I'm not mad yet. So I don't need help. So I think we need to start defining what that is in our own cultural language for it to make sense.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yes.
I agree.
I love the passion, because as you're also talking there, I'm thinking about many other things. Men's conference, talking mostly about, supporting women who just gave birth, because that's actually a very good point that you're raising there, Dr. Edith, and yes, we do see a number of men, African men, coming up today playing with their children and whatsoever, but still some communities are still resistant to that, perhaps more even with men as we come together to sort of talk about it and promote the aspect of men can also support, their partners whenever they give birth, or just to play there with their children so that the mothers can sort of focus on doing something to feel more alive again, and also more education about how to raise the boy child, because some of those things can also come from, upbringing. When you grow up and you say, well, all these things are things that can be done by a woman. As a man, I'm not going to, tap in and do this and do that. So all that is part of the education that we sort of have now as academics to sort of see how we sort of train this, and also dismiss the whole idea of part of our criticisms from our African communities to say, well, you're teaching all about these things is because of how you've been corrupted also by the Western knowledge, the Western education. So as you're traveling around the world, you're busy picking up a colonized man's mind, and you're reshaping our culture and stuff like that,
Yeah, there's that. And what Levi said before about how we don't have a word for mental health. So in the review, actually, some of the studies in the UK were showing that even though women have postnatal depression, the study said they don't refer it as depression. They call it stress or social stress. So those are the things, right, that we don't have a word for it, but we also want to avoid facing that this is happening to us. So we find words around it. But it's not just the responsibility of the person. It's not a shaming thing. Like we are all alluding to, there's a need for education around mental health. Whether we need to coin phrases for it to reach out to our people, we need to do that. And there's also a need for like the receiving countries to also recognize this and engage in, let's say, co-design studies for the people to tell their stories around how they want to talk about mental health. Because if the health professional doesn't know that this woman is sitting there saying, I feel stressed, and it means she's depressed, they will not pick it up because they don't understand the language. You're speaking very, very different languages. So it's very interesting. I would talk about the protective factors. So one thing I really love about this review is that we tell a balanced story. So we are looking at risk factors, but we're also looking at, what worked? Yeah. We don't want to just say, these are all the things that are wrong, but what worked, so that someone can pick this review and go, these are the things that are working. Are there initiatives here already? What else can we push to improve outcomes in this group? So what works? What were some of the protective factors for mental health problems in the general group? So not the women with postnatal depression. There was this thing that came up about type A behavior. So just those very annoying people that people don't like Levi. Type A, so high achieving, very high achieving, and it's amazing. But they said that this was protective because there's a very active initiative behavior around, I can solve this. I'm going to look for a solution for this. I'm going to do this, not being helpless in every situation and going, this is happening to me, or what can I actually do about it? Having that mindset of thinking positive and looking for solutions, even when it's hard sometimes. And like I said before, not everyone can do that, and everyone shouldn't do that. That's why they're leaders in society. But also, sometimes you're just traumatized. Sometimes it's just so hard. You can't find the energy to do anything. And that's also okay, but having that positivity and drive can help. But one of the things that came up from the review is that having that is okay, but don't overdo it because it increases risk of stress, which can also backfire. Okay. So that was a key thing. They also, I think one of the studies also shared around length of stay. So it gets better over time. That's the story there. And I guess that also depends on what your story is, the community and all of that. And having access to culturally sensitive community services was huge. And that takes the responsibility from the individual to the system and the government. So this review tells a very balanced story of shared responsibility. There are things that we can do, but there are a lot of other things that the systems that we're existing in can do to help us. And this involves health services, police services, social services, public services, just be sensitive. I think 3 days ago, Levi shared a very sad story on our leaders platform around a gentleman somewhere in the Canberra, was it, Levi?
Yeah, it was Canberra, yes.
Yeah, Canberra, who was in his own, I think it's an apartment complex. It sounds like a high-end apartment complex from the looks of it, from the sound of the story, who was just there by the pool, and someone called the police on him because he doesn't belong there. It doesn't look like he belongs there. So these are the things, having culturally sensitive services, police services. And then when the police came, they even did worse things than the person that called the police on the guy, which is so embarrassing. You can think of how this guy will feel going forward, And then so when this guy, for example, is very angry at the system, I understand, because this should never happen. Why should the color of your skin determine where you fit or where you should be hanging out or what fits your profile? It's just not very good. In the women with postnatal depression, the things that helped them with their mental health from the stories they told was around having mental and cultural resilience. So women felt like being resilient was helpful for them. Faith in God, So I saw Tony on one of your podcast episodes where you're reflecting on faith. And so faith was a big one for these women. Ability to nurture their child in the home. So feeling like, oh, my child is okay, my children are okay, my home is okay, is a big one. Spousal support, again, it's a very, very big one for these women. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Levi, you want to jump on maybe?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's she's really giving a good summary of what the study found. The other thing I think I might add on is the need to be proficient in English language, because if you're able to express yourself, then you'll be more comfortable to seek help. And the reason we do encourage Africans as well, or that learning of thing, when you're leaving Africa, you're actually leaving a whole lot of community behind. So with that movement comes with some stressors that you've inherited because you've just moved away. So it's good that when you come into another culture, then you start to adapt by learning the language. For instance, I lived in Saudi. The easier way to interact with people was to learn Arabic. I had to, on my own, start to learn how I can interact because they want to feel safe with you. You also want to feel safe with them. So there's a give and take from both sides that when we come in here, we should make some effort to understand the language too, to be able to say something that somebody can hear us, can understand what we're saying. I mean, there'll be a lot of struggles with that, but that's something that we've seen has improved people's mental health seeking behavior. And that made them to be able to seek out for help. The other thing I think the study, if I remember when I presented that last, that really struck to me was that the migrant women were more comfortable if their confidentiality was protected. They felt safer. They were able to speak out if they felt nobody's going to know that I'm the one who said this. But then they wanted to do that in a way that they were protected, confident, which is a normal process of care in Australia, I think. But I think we need to reinforce that. And when you go share a story with a GP or anyone, they're not going to tell it to somebody else. We'll still fear that it's going to be told somewhere because in our culture, we don't want somebody else to know what we are passing through. They want to feel the same way when they go to their service providers, to talk to a community leader. That would encourage them to seek for help. And I think the more we put this out there, the easier it is for people to relate to this story. And just to add on, Tony, I think your platform is a wonderful platform to take the discussion further. I don't see any reason why we can't have a discussion on how do men support women during childbirth. It could be a forum. It could be a gathering of men and women, like a discussion forum. That would be great to see the perspective from the women, see the perspective from the men, and what we can do together to support each other. Because it seems to be a very strong area where nothing really has been done. That leads women into that form of depression as well after delivery.
Yeah.
That sounds
totally
interesting.
agree. There's this point a couple of points that I think are important to add here.
Please do.
And Tony, we're going to talk about bewitchment later, are we? Like witchcraft?
I think you can get onto it as soon as you can, because I was also looking at times that are sort of keep you much more longer. Yes.
So one of the points that women talked about why they don't seek help is that cultural beliefs around mental health and witchcraft came up. So like Levi is saying, sometimes we don't seek help because there are things playing on our mind and we wait too long. And unfortunately, for some people, it gets too late because it becomes like a vicious loop of breakdown. But some get lucky and get help in time, and some may not make it, like Levi's friend. So a conversation around those beliefs as well, which are not helping our community seek help, is so important. And they talked about this expectation for women to be strong, which Levi mentioned earlier as well, and shame and stigma around mental health. Racial discrimination is one of the things that made women not want to seek help, because they felt like when they went to maternal care, they didn't feel like they were being listened to or seen. You know how you pay attention to someone or look at them when you talk to them can have a very different effect on how value the person feels they are to you. So these women sometimes just feel dismissed, and so they're like, let me just not even bring up anything about me. And I've had friends who have been in maternal health services where they've had very bad encounters around their mental health, like, oh, you're just too soft. Yeah, get over with it. Every woman goes through this. Get over. I know some of them are very shocking when you hear the stories, but this is happening in these communities where we live. They also talk about neglect of GPs, and then sometimes they don't feel like they are being listened to by the GP. So they are talking about something, but it's being dismissed. So that's one thing that I'm just slowing down to just hone in on that came up. Visa stress, that's a big one, which we can all relate to, and stress navigating the health system. So look, we are all very highly educated, but I struggle sometimes. I'm like, oh, so much stuff to read, which is sometimes you're tired. So having even information in the community around, oh, this is happening, or this is where you can go, and finding ways to reach these communities can be helpful, because not all these families can go onto a webpage and sort through all the information. And some websites are really good, but some are convoluted, some are hard to find. You don't even know what services there, what you can access. So that's the big thing that came up as well. And I'll stop here.
I think if I can just ask a question in terms of the witchcraft one, and part of the things I wanted to sort of question there is that, yes, we know a lot of things are dismissed in the name of this person is, bewitched, and this could be aspects of mental health challenges and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I don't want to sort of sound like witchcraft is just, a fiction in the same way. Are we able to tell, maybe as professionals? I think you're rooted in mental health more. Dr. Edith, Dr. Levi came more from optometry, which is what I found very fascinating also about the collaboration in this paper. But I know that Dr. Levi, you do have more also things you can say about witchcraft, but maybe if we can sort of unpack that, is there a way to tell really whether something, the distinction between this is mental health and this is witchcraft, so that people do not just dismiss everything, but they're also able to tell the distinction between the two?
Yeah, look, I think there is no mental health that has to do with witchcraft.
All right.
It's a medical term. If witchcraft is related to mental, it's also related to diabetes, hypertension, cancer. You can do anything if you believe in it. Moreover, we are not in Africa. I do understand people can fly like they fly anyway, but that's to me happens if you believe in them. The story I told you about my friend was a big one, because the community actually abandoned him because they thought it was witchcraft. They put a law nobody should go for the funeral, because they thought if you go there, the witchcraft is going to follow you too. And I went there, and I don't have witchcraft with me. Thank God, I'm still living. The point is, if we make this about witchcraft, we are putting people away from the discussion of mental health, because it's prevalent. It is growing in our community. I don't allude the fact that I don't deny there's witchcraft in what we believe in Africa, but that doesn't associate with one particular disease. If you remember in the past, if you had twins before, in those days, sometimes they do kill one. They also believe that it was witchcraft. There were times when albinos were not allowed in our community. They were chased into the bush. As recent as early 1970s, they were seen as witchcraft as well. There were times when if you marry a second wife, there are other rituals that you have to do as well. Those things they've given up. At some point, the Catholic Church did not believe that there was mental health as an illness. Until recently, the last 10, 15 decades, they agree that mental health is an illness. They changed the law because they've seen that those beliefs do not hold strength now. It was witchcraft as attributed to before, because there was no understanding of what mental health is. Now people study mental health as a course. It wasn't there before. For us, it was all new. But now that we the understanding we have, you'll be so surprised that even medical practitioners who are Africans believe that when you die of mental health, that is a witchcraft associated there. Medical professionals who have read these things understand there's a cure. There are preventive strategies that once you get over that border, you can have suicidal ideations. They still profess the fact that this is associated with witchcraft. That's the level of education that we need to start thinking about. And in our study, we found that higher level of education equals to better help-seeking behavior. So if we start targeting those who have that education, like you and me, to start changing their mentality about what this is really about. Witchcraft is not the problem. The problem is our attachment to what witchcraft can do. It can also kill us. I mean, if witchcraft does everything, they will kill anybody just because they don't like you. You don't have to have mental health to die for witchcraft. It's not just linked to mental health. So why are we then pushing that towards a mental health strategy? Whereas it can also do other things that can cause other illness, chronic diseases. So for me, it has nothing to do with mental health. There's no way to differentiate. It's a mental health condition. It's got a cure. There's a way to prevent that. There's management protocols that the government has put in place. Why don't we utilize those first?
Right.
Yeah, that is an excellent response from Levi, and I 100% agree with what he's saying. And the only thing I'll add there is that sometimes also people have different expression of meaning and what is meaningful to them. And so there are studies that have showed that somebody could say, oh, I've got mental health problems, and you could sometimes treat them, but if they don't believe in it, and if they are not willing to engage in the service, if they are not willing to engage in the care, then sometimes it doesn't work, or we have to meet each other halfway. So going from there is a need for a lot of education to let people know that mental health, like Levi says, is not witchcraft. If you believe that there's something we are from Africa, so we know sometimes from our cultural backgrounds, there may be some spiritual things that we believe are going on, and it differs from one person to the other. It's sort of a subjective thing. But if the person holds that belief so strongly, then when you're trying to break and tell them, oh no, you need to know that this is not spiritual, it is real, and it happens to people who don't have any demons chasing them, and it's real and all of that. We need to sort of come to that conversation from also understanding our cultural context and go, this is not happening. But if it's meaningful for you that you're also praying about this, then definitely do that. But just don't focus on just that, because this could get really bad if you don't get help,
Yeah.
So let's try to soften the conversation a little bit around what is meaningful for people. What do you want to do? Do you want to pray? You want to go to the mosque or go to church and pray about it? Definitely do that, because humans are wired to always find meaning to something. And often when that meaning is external, we feel better because it's not our fault. It's someone else doing it to us, right? So it's easy to sort of lean towards that and go, oh yeah, this is definitely happening to me because of so. And then we have different ways of dealing with things depending on who we think. And it does sometimes, like you're saying, Levi, it's a university professor, but you're like, oh my gosh, how are you doing this? Okay, so if what is meaningful for you is to engage in some spiritual practice to solve this, do that. But you need to also get medical help. And I think that's where our religious bodies can come in there, because churches have so much power. For example, religious bodies have so much power to support people because this is meaningful for them, but also encourage them to get help, because like Levi was saying, it can get suicide. People can start getting suicidal ideations, which is then very, very dangerous. Would you keep praying and praying for the person and not encourage them to seek help when they are in danger? So we, especially from Africa, like to look for a lot of meaning, but it's not just Africans, it's human, it's how humans are wired. So we have to get to that meaning thing, then people would maybe be inclined to listen more. Yeah.
I mean, I think we can exhaust the conversation as much as possible. We've gone way so far. We've addressed a lot of the findings and proposed, a few things that can be done. And I appreciate the discussion so much. Before, I probably have maybe one point from my side, one question maybe from my side. If I can ask Dr. Levi to sort of stretch forth into the new research now. I mean, the paper focuses on other contexts, but now you thought, let's go and focus on Australia. Anything different that is happening? Or maybe just speak openly about the research. What is it that you're doing now? And, all that information. Obviously, I'll put the link of the survey accessible for people so that they can, complete it, particularly the right ideal people that you're looking for in the research.
Yeah, I think thanks for that. I guess from that research findings, we've started thinking of other things. We we initially got together and decided to put up for a grant looking at women with postnatal depression. That didn't get funded, but that idea is still there. And I was chatting with Edith just before this podcast. We also from there started to look at how can we use nature to influence mental wellness. Can we get men to walk around, work together as a group in nature, and then start a conversation that they're more comfortable with? That's another area that we've started to think about. The other thing that we also started looking at is those who live in rural communities, there's really nothing happening for them. And with the migration that's coming into Australia and the push towards rural residency, trying to empower the rural communities, many Africans go there because they will get their documents as well much easier and want to serve in these communities. The communities are similar to what we see in Africa. They're not so metro-like. Life is more family-oriented. So people are moving in that space more. Can we then target those communities to look at what their mental wellness looks like? Is there something we can start with that small community to build some connections? So whilst they're moving in there, they're segregated from family, from the metro lifestyle, can they start talking to each other? Can we bring that conversation in? So that's one of the research that I sent the link to people to also complete recently. So it's a rural focus because the funders wanted something rural and it fitted into our own thinking. Can we do something in that space?
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think there's more we can talk about, but I want to also make the paper accessible for people to be able to read it and get into more details, including stuff that we have not touched. Maybe if I can allow you, Dr. Edith, you look like you're thinking about something. There's something that you thought maybe it's more important that you want to sort of chip in, or if you can give us your closing remarks in terms of our discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. This has been such an engaging and enjoyable discussion, and we hope that your audience would learn a few things from this conversation and also start conversations within their communities around some of the things that we have talked about. Like Levi said, one person reads a paper, another person works on a paper, and different things stand out to different people. So we hope that different things will stand up to different people and generate lots of conversations that can help to collectively improve our community. I'll just say that the findings of this review are many. There is just so valuable research that we've done here, and there's so much to be taken out of this. And from an advocacy perspective, there is a lot that can be taken out of this review to start advocating for little communities and big communities alike. So we're encouraging people to take up their findings and start using it in their own way to encourage and educate their communities and make a difference in their community. The review shows that I think it aligns a lot with the public health perspective of shared responsibility. So we find a lot of factors that are sort of personal or relate to the individual's role in the mental health struggle or journey, but there are also system factors which we have also talked about. So I think those are my closing remarks about how that we both sides have a shared responsibility in this, the person or the individual, and then there is the system or the government, and both sides need to do their best in this regard to help improve mental health outcomes for first generation voluntary African migrants, but not just this migrant group, for migrants in general, really. Because in the discussion of the review, we talk about some of the factors that have been linked to mental health in other migrant groups. Some are different, some are similar. So there's a need to be aware of these findings, be aware of these papers, and see what can be done for respective communities. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Dr. Levi?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think, Tony, the button is in your court now. I think you've started this discussion. Let's not let it slide. We don't need to continue this. It doesn't have to be with Edith and Levi. It's got to do with other communities coming together to say, what can we do, even if just for the women I suggested, and get that conversation going, because that talk means people start thinking about research. Just this discussion, I'm thinking about what next can we do, Edith. We've paused the button somewhere. What's the next step? And that now makes us start looking. I think there's need to continue this discussion. The other thing I think as well is, let's not forget these traditional healers and the spiritual people. These are the community that we need to tap into as well. Is there a way we can educate the chief priest in your village, to talk to them about mental health, to let them understand that this is what it is, because they really don't have this idea that we do have. And they influence a lot of people. by just what their sayings are, not that the church leaders do too. So that community is something we have to think about, ways of navigating or getting into that community to start to talk about this in a positive way. We have to reverse this from mental health to mental wellness, because if you're well, then you're not going to be sick. So looking at what are those things that will make people better, get better mental wellness. I think that discussion has to keep happening, and platforms like this are very instrumental to championing that goal.
Amazing. I want to take this time to thank both of you for sharing on your expertise, your research, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks, Visions and Tones, for listening in. That was Dr. Edith Botchway-Commey and Dr. Uchechukwu Levi Osuagwu. And I'll chat to you next time. Have a good one. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Tony. Take care.
Thanks, Tony.